A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Naki. A new episode every single day. Episode 16, Night Vigil. The sun died behind the crags, leaving the necropolis of Igi bathed in the sickly, flickering light of the rising funeral pyres. The air, heavy with the scent of pine resin and ozone, had turned brittle. The funeral march had reached the threshold, but the customary rites, the cremation, the games, and the solemn return to Pella had disintegrated into a high-stakes standoff. The silence that governed the stone vault was like the very flesh of congealed time. Inside the chilly air of the catacomb, the sharp skin-piercing scent of fresh mortar fused sinisterly with the heavy, sweet, resinous fragrance of myrrh and frankincense, applied to ransom the body of the prematurely taken king from decay. Queen Eurydice stood by the side of the sarcophagus, motionless, as if refusing to allow even the faintest sound of her black mourning garments brushing against the cold stone floor. In her eyes lay no tears for the loss of her beloved eldest son, but rather the phosphorescence of a manic tenacity toward the ghastly power struggle about to unfold. She pressed her slender, pale fingertips against the forehead of the dead Alexander II. As those fingertips stained themselves with the absolute coldness of the king's skin, which had already begun its post-mortem rigidity, she seemed to be branding a final curse into his very brain. Beside her, Princess Eurino, not yet 20, let her flesh, as lush and plump as the juice of a fresh fruit, tremble in small shudders, her face buried against the cold chestplate of her brother's armor as she wept in secret. "Let us go, Eurino." The queen's voice echoed against the jet-black subterranean walls, carrying a brittle rigidity as though marble itself were cracking. "We no longer possess words to offer this dead man. For the living, a harsher, far more ruthless ritual awaits." Clasping the princess's trembling shoulders with a merciless strength, the queen departed into the upper world through the dramas, a passage like a dark birth canal, without looking back even once. Her stride was not that of a widow consumed by grief, but the step of a priestess advancing toward an altar of vengeance. Left behind were only the two princes, Philip and Perdiccas. A single lamp, flickering upon a bronze tripod, sputtered ominously in the thin subterranean air. Its wavering cast the shadows of the two boys against the coarse limestone walls, magnifying them into the shapes of monstrous giants that writhed unsettlingly. Between them, upon a raised stone dais, lay the corpse of the young king in eternal sleep, waiting for the dawn that would hurl him into the cremating flames and reduce him to empty ash. Philip stood erect at the head of the bier. Upon his 14-year-old unripened face, painful bruises were carved by the mud of the day's forced march, and the dust that had whipped them like a pitiless lash. Yet his gaze remained miraculously serene. Perdiccas, meanwhile, sat collapsed upon the floor, his head leaning against the cold stone wall. His eyes, bloodshot with the exhaustion of the vigil and with terror, were hollow, as if hollowed out from within. From the world above, the muffled, jagged sounds of Ptolemy's guards filtered through the thick stone door, vibrating against the very marrow of the prince's bones. These were not the disciplined movements of a professional army. They were the erratic, desperate thrashings of men who had been pushed to the edge of sanity by the Illyrian fires and now sought to drown their terror in wine. It was a form of exquisite psychological torture. The guards were drinking not out of triumph, but out of a manic need to numb the fear of the shadows ringing the valley. Their laughter, thick and vulgar, floated down the dramas, punctuated by the sharp, sickening clatter of high-status ritual pottery being smashed against the tomb's limestone exterior. They had begun to sing, a discordant bawdy tavern tune that collided hideously with the distant, mournful wail of the priests. Funeral chants, creating a sensory dissonance that felt like a desecration of time itself. To Philip and Perdiccas, trapped in the subterranean chill, the noise was not merely ambient. It was the sound of their world being dismantled. Every ribald shout and every crash of breaking clay seemed to rattle the bronze tripod holding their flickering lamp, making the shadows of the two brothers dance like trembling, monstrous ghosts upon the coarse walls. "He looks smaller now," Perdiccas whispered, his teeth chattering in time with the thumping overhead. His voice was thin, almost entirely swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. As if the life that once resided in his flesh was the only regal ornament he possessed. Now he is just a stripped piece of meat, waiting to be cast into the fire while they mock us from the surface. Philip did not look up from his brother's beer, his face a mask of cold, metallic stillness. He stared at the floor, forcing his mind to ignore the drunken stomping above, treating the vulgarity of the guards as the backdrop to his own internal forging. He was using the noise, letting the vibration of their intrusion serve as the anvil upon which his own resolve was being hammered into shape. He has a lesson, Perdiccas, Philip murmured, as if reciting a dark catechism. He died because he couldn't see past the end of his own nose. He was so arrogant, so convinced that every whim of his was law, that he never stopped to think 3 steps ahead. He lived for the moment, making decisions based on pride alone, never once calculating how his actions would corner him later. He gestured toward the ceiling, where the muffled, discordant roar of the encampment echoed through the tomb. His final mistake was cutting against the factions instead of balancing them. He thought he could just slash his way through the nobles and stay standing, but he didn't realize he was building his own trap. He couldn't see the disaster coming until it was already at his throat. We have to be smarter than that. We have to think 3, 4, 5 steps ahead, or we'll end up just like him, staring at a blade we should have seen coming months ago. He gestured toward the ceiling, where the muffled, discordant roar of the encampment echoed through the tomb, a cacophony of panicked shouting and the rhythmic thud of feet. "Listen to them," Philip said, his lip curling in a ghost of a sneer. "They are not soldiers tonight. They are a mob, terrified by the very fire they've been ordered to light, feeding on the remnants of our dignity because they have none of their own. They believe they are participating in a grand rite, but they are only insects caught in a web." He turned to his brother, his eyes reflecting the deep, unsettling calm of someone who had already calculated the price of survival. "Let them believe what they will," he said, his hand resting on the hilt of his short sword. "Let them believe that Ptolemy is the architect of this transition and that their futures are secure in his hands. If they think they are the ones holding the power, then they have already forgotten the most basic truth of our blood. The man who laughs loudest before the executioner is rarely the one who holds the blade." Perdiccas looked up in dread, a distinct shadow of terror flitting across his pale face. "Ptolemy is just outside, Philip. He has seized command of the army, and with your no, he has compromised the sanctity of our house. Once the funeral concludes, he will ascend to the regency. Beneath his overwhelming boot, what are we but 2 mere stones waiting to be trodden upon and crushed?" "We are the stones that will trip him," Philip declared ruthlessly. He leaned over the corpse and hovered his young blood-warmed hand over the gold mask covering Alexander's face, a mask that mimicked the expressionless dignity of the dead. "But we cannot trip him together. If we remain here together, he will crush us both with a single blow. To preserve the Macedonian bloodline, if one must become the king in the cage who whets his fangs, the other must become the blade in the dark that aims for the prey's throat." Philip reached into the folds of his coarse tunic and withdrew a simple wooden bawn, the Scytale, a secret device used to wrap and decipher covert dispatches. He laid it solemnly across the armored chest of their dead brother. "Ptolemy intends to send me to the south, to Thebes." Philip breathed, as if wary of phantoms eavesdropping against the tomb walls. He frames it as the necessary exile of a younger prince, a way to keep the line of succession orderly, while he stabilizes the regency. He thinks he's merely removing a potential nuisance from the court, but he is actually sending me to the one place where I can learn the cold tactics required to eventually challenge the order he is building. Perdiccas sprang to his feet, gripping Philip's slender shoulder so hard that his own fingertips turned white. "That place is a bottomless death trap. In that fierce city, if the war in the south turns against Macedonia, they will ruthlessly discard their hostage shield and execute you first as a spite to the north. The stratagem you think will deceive him will only become your own grave. Let them try," Philip countered coldly. Within his eyes, the bearing of a sovereign had already taken root. "Whether Ptolemy orchestrated the chaos that took our brother, or is simply a vulture circling the aftermath, his goal is the same, to ensure we remain weak and isolated. While I taste the mud in Thebes, you must survive here in Pella. Play the part of the compliant boy king, moved by his strings to absolute perfection. Be silent. Let him believe you are a helpless reed already snapped. But every single night, watch the movements of the generals. Learn who accepts his gold and who curses the stench of the opportunism that put him in power. And when the time is right," he took Perdiccas' trembling hand and forced it down, pressing it over Alexander's cold, unyielding breastplate. Swear it, Philip commanded with an inescapable majesty that seemed to vibrate through the marble walls. Swear that you will hold this Macedonian throne, even if you must drag yourself through the mud and crawl across the earth. And I swear that I will return to this land leading a phalanx that will make Ptolemy's guards look like children playing with sticks. At that moment, a heavy, oppressive thud echoed against the thick stone door of the tomb as the iron butt of a spear slammed into it. The guard is changing. A rough voice barked from the outside, thick with the cold of the night air. Princes, out at once. The priests must perform the final anointing of the body. The brothers broke apart, as if reluctant to part with the warmth of each other's flesh. Perdiccas wiped his tears roughly with his sleeve, his spine straightening with a new grim resolve. Philip tucked the baton back into the inside of his tunic. Within that brief span of time, the wood had grown strangely warm, absorbing the heat of his skin. They shared one last look over the golden mask of the brother they had lost, a silent contract made in the darkness that the next time they met, they would no longer be the helpless victims of history. As they stepped out from the heavy, suffocating air of the underground into the biting night cold, Ptolemy of Elorus stood waiting like a shadow, a blazing torch in his hand. He looked at their red, swollen eyes, convinced he was seeing the powerless tears of children who had lost a kinsman, and a complacent sneer drifted across his thin lips. He did not realize, however. He failed to realize that the two boys standing before his very eyes were the first quiet sparks of a monstrous, consuming fire that would soon burn his flesh and his ambitions to absolute nothingness. Ptolemy moved with the jagged, uneven rhythm of a man whose nerves had been stretched beyond their breaking point. He was not a conqueror at this moment. He was a man trying to stack stones on a slope of shifting scree. His boots dragged in the sacred dust, and his face, mapped by the gray pallor of utter exhaustion, twitched with every distant crackle of the Illyrian fires ringing the valley. He didn't roar because he was confident. He barked because the silence of the valley and the predatory stillness of the surrounding camps terrified him. "The scaffolding," he muttered, his voice raspy and drained of its former steel. He stood at the base of the massive, unlit timber grid, rubbing his eyes with trembling fingers, as if he could wipe away the encroaching darkness. If the pyre isn't balanced, the draft will be uneven. Everything hinges on this structure. If the logs shift, if the ritual falters, there will be no order left to cling to. Just finish it. It was a performance stripped of all grandeur. He clung to the funeral preparations, not as a masterstroke of political theater, but as a lifeline, a singular, concrete task, to distract him from the cold reality that his grip on the army was dissolving. He watched the priest with heavy-lidded, bloodshot eyes, his movements sluggish and mechanical. When he leaned in to thrust a purse of silver into a trembling priest's hand, the coins rattled hollowly, a sound more desperate than authoritative. "The genealogies must be flawless," he rasped, his breath coming in shallow, shuddering gasps. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a frantic, saliva-flecked whisper. "I want the recitation to be long. I want every king from Perdiccas to the present named clearly and without hesitation. If the army hears the line of succession spoken with enough reverence, they will remember who they serve. Do you understand? Let the priests chant until their throats bleed. I want the air so thick with the names of the ancestors that no one dares to look toward the dark." He turned away, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground of the necropolis, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, not in a gesture of challenge, but for the balance it provided his sagging frame. He didn't scan the darkness with the general's focus. He peered into it with a hunted man's paranoia. Every rustle of the oaks, every flicker of distant torchlight from the Theban harbor formations, hollowed him out further. He was shivering, his coat damp with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the night air. He knew the Theban iron was out there, an inexorable, silent tide in the dark, and he felt the crushing weight of the trap closing in. He was not weaving a crown tonight. He was merely trying to keep his hands from shaking long enough to survive until the dawn, when the pyre would finally demand his presence. While Ptolemy frenzied in the shadow of the pyre, General Attalus had transformed the great tumulus into an island of absolute defiance. He had withdrawn his old guard, those scarred, gray-bearded veterans who had bled for the late king and viewed the current state of affairs as nothing short of a desecration, into a tight, interlocking ring that encircled the royal tombs like a serpent of bronze and oak. Attalus had effectively established a no-man's land around the limestone threshold. Any mercenary attempting to cross the perimeter was met instantly with the forest-thick weight of leveled sarissas. Ptolemy's captains had come 3 times with demands offering titles and gold, and each time they had been met with the same cold, rhythmic clatter of shields and the absolute, unyielding wall of the guard. Now, as the night deepened, Attalus sat alone on a massive, weathered limestone block directly in front of the tomb entrance. In his calloused hands, he held a whetstone and his battle-worn xiphus. The rasp of the stone against the steel was the only sound in the immediate vicinity of the tomb, a rhythmic grating cadence that seemed to mock the frantic, whispered prayers of the priests nearby. He didn't look at the pyre, nor did he look at the regent pacing the perimeter. He was a sentinel carved from the same mountain rock as the necropolis itself. He was holding the king's body hostage, effectively stripping the regent of the very legitimacy he sought to buy with his hurried rituals. A young lieutenant stepped up, his armor reflecting the dying embers of the camps, and leaned in to whisper, "The regent's men are massing at the lower terrace, General. They look ready to force the path." Attalus didn't stop the motion of his whetstone. He didn't even look up. "Let them try," he rumbled, the vibration of his voice deeper than the distant, muffled drums of the marching armies. "My men are not here for politics, and they are not here for gold. We are here to ensure that the House of Amyntas finds its peace without being used as a platform for a usurper." He checked the edge of his blade, the steel gleaming with a wicked, mirror-like intensity under the moonlight. He was waiting for a signal, a word, or even a subtle shift in the wind from the royal carriage where Eurydice held her silent court. Until that moment came, he was the immovable anchor in the storm. The veterans behind him stood in perfect, terrifying unison, their breathing rhythmic, their eyes fixed on the darkness, guaranteeing that the royal funeral would remain a sacred rite and never, under any circumstances, a Ptolemaic spectacle. While the necropolis hummed with the frantic, discordant energy of Ptolemy's desperate rites, a different kind of presence defined the perimeter. Parmenion had moved his veteran phalanx of Upper Macedonians into a silent, ominous crescent just beyond the flickering reach of the pyre light. He did not march into the necropolis to pay his respects, nor did he retreat into the mountain gloom. He simply occupied the space, a massive, unmoving anchor in a sea of drifting allegiances. Inside his command tent, lit by a single guttering oil lamp, Parmenion sat hunched over a map of the valley, the heavy bronze of his pauldrons catching the dim light. Surrounding him, his officers stood in a grim, attentive circle, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. They were not waiting for orders from the regent. They were waiting for the inevitable moment when the political architecture of the kingdom collapsed. Parmenion had issued a singular, uncompromising directive, denying entry to all. Whether it was a Theban scout seeking to plant a blade in the dark, or one of Ptolemy's sweat-drenched messengers gasping for reinforcements, no one passed the crescent without producing an untainted royal signet. It was a direct, calculated insult to the regent's authority, yet it was delivered with such professional, icy indifference that Ptolemy's men could find no excuse to start the fight they were currently too weak to win. Parmenion was the heavy silence in the valley. By holding his position at the edge of the field, he effectively partitioned the battlefield. He was the ultimate arbiter, forcing every other actor, from the scheming barons in the brush to the wolfish Thebans creeping through the ravines, to calculate their next move around the terrifying, immovable fact of his phalanx. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to declare a side. He sat in the dark, watching the pyre with a clinical gaze, knowing that his men, the hardest iron in the kingdom, would be the final weight on the scale. Every eye in the valley, whether belonging to a king or a pretender, was fixed on his tent, wondering the same thing. When the first torch finally struck the wood and the Argead transition began, would the crescent of Parmenion's shields tighten around the regent, or would it turn and crush him? Parmenion said nothing, leaving the silence to grow until it was heavier than the threat of war itself. While the rest of the kingdom fixated on the morbid theater of the pyre, Antipater moved through the encampment like a ghost of the state itself. He had no interest in the ghosts of the Argeads. His concern was the cold, hard machinery of the living. Under the veil of the funeral vigil, he moved between the logistical outposts and the supply wagons, conducting a final, surgical audit of the kingdom's remaining assets. His movements were quiet, accompanied only by the soft, rhythmic clicking of his signet ring against the ledger boards he carried beneath his cloak. He had already set the trap. The master key to the royal armory, the very heart of Pella's military readiness, had been misplaced in the confusion of the march, and he had personally countermanded the orders of the remaining Pella guard captains. Instead of reinforcing the sacred perimeter of the necropolis, they were now deployed along the remote grain routes, effectively abandoning the burial site to the mercy of the competing factions. He spent the remainder of the night in a series of hushed, hurried meetings with the mercantile lords, men whose eyes were sharper than any generals. In the flickering glow of a single candle, he presented them with the ledgers. They didn't speak of loyalty to the regent nor of the tragedy of the king. They spoke of the only language that survived a collapsing dynasty, silver and survival. "The vault will be empty by dawn," Antipater whispered, his voice as dry and sterile as parchment. "Any gold remaining in the royal cache is being redirected to the northern warehouses. When the smoke clears tomorrow, Pella will belong to whoever owns the bread, not whoever owns the crown." He was bankrupting the monarchy in real time, siphoning the lifeblood of the Macedonian war machine into private, untraceable caches. He wasn't just observing the struggle for the throne, he was ensuring that the throne itself would be utterly worthless to whoever claimed it. As he extinguished the candle and vanished back into the dark, Antipater possessed the cold, grim satisfaction of an architect who had spent his life building a temple, only to spend his final hour preparing to watch it burn to the ground. When the winner finally emerged from the ashes of the funeral, they would find themselves the master of nothing but a hollow, starving shell. Scytale used the cover of the funeral vigil to move among the younger, restless nobles like a shadow. He was no longer just whispering, he was organizing a loyalist vanguard. He circulated the camp, stoking the fire of the younger heirs by pointing to the desecration of the funeral by the regent's foreign mercenaries. He was preparing his followers to initiate the funeral games as a literal combat trial, a way to force a duel for the throne under the guise of an ancient rite. The Ismenias have successfully ghosted through the outer perimeter, moving through the thick smoke of the funeral preparations. They were not attacking, they were assisting. They positioned themselves as the silent guards of the royal heirs, Philip and Perdiccas. They offered to secure the perimeter for the queen, effectively creating a Theban screen around the Argead princes. They were now the invisible masters of the royal family's immediate safety, ensuring that they, and not Ptolemy's men, would dictate who spoke to the heirs and who does not. Bartolus had not moved his main force, but his archers and light infantry had tightened the net, until the very air seemed to vibrate with the hum of drawn bowstrings. He had ordered his mountain-born marksmen to ring the entire necropolis, with small, controlled fires, turning the sacred burial ground into a brightly lit, high-contrast stage where every nervous gesture of the Macedonian guard was visible to his hidden observers on the cliffs. Perched upon a jagged obsidian outcrop, Bartolus sat in heavy, stoic silence, watching the scene below with the predatory satisfaction of a hawk circling a wounded animal. Beside him, his son Cletus sat with his hand resting on the pommel of a heavy broadsword, his eyes dark with impatience. Near them, Odita stood at the very edge of the precipice, her slender silhouette sharp against the night sky. She held a light hunting bow, her fingers tracing the string with a rhythmic, lethal grace as she scanned the campfires below. Her father, the Illyrian prince, stood just a step behind them, his face a mask of iron as he observed the Macedonian chaos. "Look at them, grandfather," Odata whispered, her voice cutting through the whistling wind like a flint knife. "They scramble like rats in a burning barn. They are so busy painting their masks of grief that they don't even realize the walls of their own tomb are already glowing with our fire." "They are lost in their own theater, little bird," Bartolus replied, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "They play at being kings, clinging to their lineages and their rights, while the very kingdom they claim to lead burns at the edges. They think this is a funeral. They do not know it is an execution." Cletus spat on the ground, his gaze fixed on the shimmering phalanx of Parmenion. "Let us descend, father. The regent is distracted. We could be at the throat of that garrison before the final chant is finished." Bartolus held up a gnarled, weathered hand, silencing his son. "Patience is a weapon, Cletus. If we strike now, they fight like cornered wolves. If we wait, they will tear each other apart for the scraps of their own authority. Let the rot finish its work." Bartolus turned his piercing ancient gaze to the valley, where the Macedonians were trapped deep in the gullet of the pass. He signaled for a single envoy to be dispatched, a rider who carried no weapon, only a parchment sealed with the black wax of the Illyrian crown. The rider descended the perilous path, reaching the main gate of the necropolis, just as the torches flared. His voice rang out, clear and mocking, carrying over the rhythmic, muffled thumping of the old guard's shields. King Perdiccas offers his formal condolences for the fallen king, the envoy shouted, his words a cold, biting demand that hung in the smoke-filled air. But a funeral requires peace, and the dead deserve silence. If the regent cannot keep the peace among his own men, the Illyrian crown will be forced to intervene to restore order and protect the sanctity of the grave. High above, Perdiccas watched with a faint, dangerous smile, his hand resting on his staff, waiting to see if Ptolemy would swallow the bait. He was daring them to start the violence, to turn their desperate swords toward the mountains. He knew the geography better than the architects who had built these tombs. He knew that, if they moved to attack, they would only be marching deeper into the trap of their own final resting place, leaving their backs exposed to the fire of the Illyrian gods. To be continued in Episode 17. Clandestine Compact. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.